A lone man, scarred by war and loss, kneels beside a dying Lakota boy in the shadow of the Black Hills, defying the hatred that burns across the 1877 Dakota Plains. Jonas Mercer, a Civil War veteran haunted by ghosts of his past, risks everything for a single act of mercy, one that could ignite a storm of vengeance or forge an unlikely bond. Will his choice reshape the frontier's bloody divide, or will it bury him beneath it? Subscribe now to uncover the full tale and share where you're listening from. Can one man's compassion rewrite a legacy of war? Stay tuned to find out. The Dakota Territory in 1877 stretched like a sea of secrets, its grasses whispering tales of blood and defiance after Little Bighorn's echo still hung heavy in the air. Jonas Mercer, a man carved from the Civil War's ashes, worked his small ranch near the Black Hills, where the earth was as hard as the memories he carried. At 39, his hands were calloused, his eyes shadowed by the ghosts of a wife and son lost to fever. The prairie didn't care for his grief. It demanded sweat, and Jonas gave it, mending fences under a sun that scorched the ground to cracked leather. Dust clung to his boots as he drove a post into the earth, the rhythm of his hammer a lonely drumbeat against the vast silence. The Black Hills loomed in the distance, dark and jagged, like the teeth of some ancient beast. A faint haze of smoke lingered, prairie fires from last night's lightning, their bitter scent curling through the air. Jonas paused, wiping sweat from his brow, when a flicker caught his eye near the dry creek bed that snaked through his land. At first, he thought it was a coyote, slinking low in the heat's shimmer. But as he squinted, his gut twisted. It wasn't an animal. It was a boy. The child staggered through the tall grass, his small frame swaying like a reed in a storm. Dark hair matted to his face, his steps faltered, each one weaker than the last. Jonas's hand drifted to the Colt at his hip, old habits from years fighting men who looked like this boy's kin. But the child's sunken cheeks, the way his bony fingers clutched his stomach, stopped Jonas cold. This wasn't a warrior. This was a kid, maybe 10, teetering on the edge of death. Jonas approached, boots crunching over brittle earth, hands raised to show no threat. The boy's eyes, dark as storm clouds, met his, wild with fear, cracked lips trembling. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped, his hand pointing weakly to his mouth, then to the creek's empty bed. "Easy, kid," Jonas murmured, voice low like he was calming a spooked horse. He knelt, studying the boy's tattered buckskin, the dust caked into his skin. Lakota, no doubt. Alone. Starving. He scooped the boy up, light as a bundle of kindling, and carried him toward the weathered cabin that squatted at the heart of his ranch. The boy's head lolled against his shoulder, breath shallow. As Jonas crossed the threshold, the fading light caught a glint at the boy's throat. A silver pendant, etched with a wolf's head, its craftsmanship sharp and unmistakable. Jonas's blood ran cold. He'd heard whispers in Deadwood saloons about Grey Wolf, the Lakota chief whose name was a curse among settlers, a man who burned homesteads and vanished like smoke. This pendant marked the boy as his blood, his son if the rumors held. Jonas set the boy on his cot, the old frame creaking under even that slight weight. He fetched a tin cup of water from the barrel, holding it to the boy's lips. The kid drank greedily, hands shaking, water dribbling down his chin. Jonas tore off a chunk of cornbread from the stove, softened it with broth, and watched the boy devour it like a starved dog. Each bite seemed to pull him back from the grave, color creeping into his hollow face. Outside, the prairie held its breath. The wind had stilled, and the distant crackle of fires faded. Jonas sat at his scarred table, the oil lamp casting long shadows across the room. His fingers traced the Colt's grip, not out of want, but reflex. He'd fought Lakota before, seen their shadows in the hills, heard their war cries tear through the night. Back then, he'd pulled the trigger without hesitation. But now, staring at this boy, he saw only a child, not an enemy. Yet that pendant changed everything. If Grey Wolf's riders were searching for this kid, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd come with blades and guns, and Jonas's cabin would be kindling by dawn. He poured a shot of whiskey, the burn steadying his nerves. The boy stirred, mumbling in his sleep. A name, maybe? Or a prayer in Lakota. Jonas didn't know the tongue, but the sound carried a weight that settled in his chest. He'd buried his own son under a cottonwood tree 3 years back, watched fever steal him while he stood helpless. Now, this boy, this stranger, had stumbled into his life, and Jonas couldn't look away. The prairie was a cruel judge. It didn't care for good deeds or old wounds. As the lamp flickered, Jonas glanced at the boy's pendant again, its wolf eyes glinting like a warning. He knew what he'd done, saved a life, but he also knew what it might cost. Somewhere out there, hooves were already pounding the earth, and they were coming for him. As the oil lamp's flicker painted the cabin walls with shadows, Jonas Mercer sat vigil over the sleeping Lakota boy, the wolf pendant glinting like a silent accusation. Dawn was coming, and with it, a reckoning he could feel in his bones. The prairie outside his window lay still, but its quiet was a lie, a coiled rattlesnake waiting to strike. The first rays of sun bled across the horizon, staining the grasslands crimson. Jonas hadn't slept, his eyes fixed on the boy's shallow breaths, his mind churning with the weight of what he'd done. He'd saved a life, but out here, in the Dakota Territory of 1877, mercy could be a death sentence. The air grew heavy, the silence shattered by a low rumble that rose like thunder from the hills. Hooves. Hundreds of them. Jonas's heart thudded as he stepped to the window, peering through the warped glass. A dust cloud swelled in the distance, dark shapes emerging like specters from the morning mist. He grabbed his hat, leaving the Colt on the table. A gun wouldn't help now, not against what was coming. Stepping onto the porch, he faced the storm. The Lakota war party fanned out across the ridge, their horses snorting steam in the cool dawn. At their center, astride a massive roan stallion, sat Grey Wolf. The chief's broad frame was draped in buckskin, his face streaked with war paint, black and red lines that spoke of battles won and blood spilled. His eyes burned with a fury that could level mountains, fixed on Jonas like a hawk on a hare. Behind Grey Wolf, a young warrior with a jagged scar across his cheek, Red Knife, Jonas reckoned, gripped a lance, his glare promising death. The war party, nearly 200 strong, formed a crescent around the barn, their rifles and bows glinting in the rising light. Feathers swayed in the breeze, and the faint jingle of bridles cut through the air like a warning bell. Jonas raised his hands, palms open, his voice steady despite the ice in his veins. "I didn't take him. He was starving, half dead by the creek. I gave him food, water, and a place to rest." A murmur rippled through the riders, sharp and distrustful. Red Knife spat into the dirt, his voice a snarl in Lakota, the word Wasichu slicing through like a blade. Jonas didn't need to know the tongue to feel the venom. Grey Wolf raised a hand, silencing the unrest, but his gaze never wavered. "You hold my blood," he said, his English rough but clear, each word heavy as stone. "Return him, or this land drinks yours." Jonas's jaw tightened. "He's inside, alive because of me. Come see for yourself." The chief's eyes narrowed, weighing the truth in Jonas's face. Before he could respond, the cabin door creaked open. The boy stumbled out, his small frame wrapped in Jonas's old blanket, the wolf pendant gleaming at his throat. He froze, eyes wide at the sea of warriors, then ran to Jonas, clinging to his leg with a strength that belied his frailty. The sight stopped the riders cold. Even Red Knife's scowl faltered, his lance lowering an inch. Grey Wolf dismounted, his boots hitting the earth with a thud that seemed to echo across the plains. He stepped forward, his presence filling the space like a gathering storm. "You knew who he was," he said, pointing to the pendant. "Yet you kept him." Jonas met his gaze, unflinching. "I kept him from dying. Wasn't gonna leave a kid to the coyotes, no matter whose blood he carries." Red Knife barked something sharp, his horse stepping forward, but Grey Wolf's raised hand held him back. The chief's eyes flicked to the boy, then back to Jonas, searching for deceit. "Words are wind," he said. "Prove them, Wasichu, or die where you stand." He gestured toward the hills, where the war party's shadows stretched long and menacing. "You will come to our camp. The elders will judge your heart." Jonas's stomach sank. Walking into a Lakota camp, surrounded by men who'd sooner gut him than listen, was a fool's errand. But staying here meant a bloodbath, his cabin torched, his grave unmarked. He glanced at the boy, whose dark eyes held a flicker of trust, and nodded once. "I'll come." Grey Wolf mounted his horse, the warriors parting like a river around him. Red Knife's glare promised no mercy, his fingers twitching on his lance. As Jonas helped the boy onto a spare horse, the prairie seemed to tighten around them, the air thick with the weight of what lay ahead. The war party turned, hooves pounding the earth, and Jonas followed, riding toward judgment under a sky that burned red as blood. The Dakota plains stretched endlessly under a blood-red sky as Jonas Mercer rode toward the Lakota camp, the boy close at his side, surrounded by a sea of warriors whose silence was louder than any war cry. The hooves' rhythm pulsed like a heartbeat, each step pulling him deeper into a world that had once been his enemy's. Night fell, and the camp emerged over a low rise, a constellation of fires flickering against the dark. Teepees stood like sentinels, their hides painted with stories of battles and spirits, glowing orange in the firelight. The air carried the scent of smoke and sage, thick with the weight of judgment. Jonas dismounted, his boots sinking into the hard-packed earth. The boy clung to his hand, the wolf pendant at his throat catching the fire's glow. Grey Wolf led them to the camp's heart, where a great fire roared in a pit ringed by 7 elders, their faces etched with lines deeper than the Dakota canyons. Their eyes, sharp as flint, studied Jonas like he was a riddle carved in stone. Red Knife stalked nearby, his scarred face twisted with distrust, his lance never far from reach. The gathered warriors formed a tight circle, their war paint gleaming, weapons glinting like promises of blood. Grey Wolf spoke first, his voice low and steady, translating the boy's story for the elders. The child stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear, recounting the storm that tore him from his people, the hunger that gnawed his bones, the cold that clawed his skin. He pointed to Jonas, miming the water, the bread, the blanket, small acts that had pulled him back from death's edge. The camp listened, but the elders' faces remained unreadable, their silence heavier than the prairie night. Red Knife broke the quiet, his voice a snarl in Lakota, his finger jabbing toward Jonas. "Wasichu lies," he spat, the words needing no translation. His eyes burned with a hatred born of lost kin and broken promises. The crowd stirred, murmurs rising like wind before a storm. Jonas stood tall, his heart hammering, but his face carved from the same stubborn oak as his cabin. He'd faced death before, on battlefields, in fevered nights. But this was different. This was a trial of his soul. The eldest of the council, a man with hair white as winter grass, raised a hand. His voice, rough as gravel, carried through Grey Wolf's translation. "The boy speaks truth, but truth is a shadow. It shifts, We must know if this man's heart is steady." He gestured to a warrior lying near the fire, his leg wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, a wound festering from a cavalry saber's bite. "Tend to him, Wasichu. Show us your mercy is not a mask." Jonas's breath caught. Memories of war flooded back. Gunshots ringing across hills. Lakota warriors falling under his aim, their blood soaking the earth. Guilt twisted in his gut, sharp as a blade. He knelt beside the wounded man, whose eyes locked on his with a mix of pain and defiance. The camp's gaze bore down, every breath held, every hand near a weapon. Jonas's fingers trembled as he unwrapped the cloth, revealing torn flesh and seeping blood. He'd patched men before, but never under eyes that hungered for his death. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound with water from a clay jug, his hand steady despite the ghosts whispering in his mind. He tore strips from his own shirt, binding the gash with care, each movement deliberate, like mending a fence under a storm's shadow. The warrior's breathing eased, his clenched jaw softening. The camp watched, still as stone, even Red Knife's scowl faltering as Jonas tied the final knot. The elders conferred, their murmurs blending with the fire's crackle. Jonas rose, wiping blood from his hands, his chest tight with the weight of their verdict. He glanced at the boy, whose eyes held a flicker of hope. "If you're moved by stories of unlikely bonds on the frontier," Jonas seemed to hear his own heart say, "subscribe to this channel to hear more tales of courage and redemption. Share where you're listening from. It's a journey we're on together." The words felt right, a quiet plea woven into the moment, as if the prairie itself urged the tale to spread. The white-haired elder stood again, his gaze piercing Jonas like an arrow. Through Grey Wolf, he spoke. "Your hands have spoken louder than your words, but one act does not erase history." The firelight danced across his face, casting shadows that seemed to weigh the cost of every life lost on these plains. "You will face one final test, Wasichu. The spirits demand it." Jonas exhaled, the air thick with sage and tension. The camp's fires burned low, but the trial was far from over, and the Dakota night held its judgment close, like a blade pressed to the throat. The Dakota night pressed close, its silence sharp as a drawn blade, as the Lakota elder's words hung in the air. One final test. Jonas Mercer stood by the fire, its embers casting fleeting shadows across his weathered face. The boy, still clutching his hand, looked up with eyes that held both fear and faith. The camp's tension coiled tighter, a storm waiting to break. The white-haired elder stepped forward, his voice like dry grass underfoot, carried through Grey Wolf's steady translation. "You have shown mercy, Wasichu, but mercy is a seed. It must grow through time." He gestured to the vast prairie beyond the firelight. "Swear this. If any of our people, lost, wounded, or hungry, cross your land, you will aid them as you aided my chief's son. Swear it, and live." Jonas's chest tightened. The oath was a chain, binding him to a people he'd once fought, a people whose blood still stained his memories. But the boy's grip, small and fierce, anchored him. He saw his own son's face in those dark eyes, a ghost he'd buried under a cottonwood tree. Refusing meant death, not just his, but the boy's fragile hope. "I swear it," Jonas said, voice low but firm, like a stake driven into hard earth. The elders nodded, their faces unreadable, but Red Knife's scowl burned hotter, his fingers twitching near his blade. Grey Wolf stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the firelight. "Keep this oath, Wasichu, and you may yet belong to this land." His eyes, sharp as obsidian, held Jonas's for a long moment before he turned, signaling the warriors to break their circle. The boy, released to his father, looked back at Jonas, his small hand raised in a gesture that needed no words. Jonas nodded, a silent promise sealed under the star-strewn sky. The ride back to his ranch was a blur, the prairie a black sea under moonlight. The warriors escorted him, their silence heavy but no longer hostile. As his cabin's silhouette rose against the dawn, they vanished into the grass, leaving only hoofprints and the weight of the oath. Jonas stepped inside, the boy's absence a hollow ache. He sat by the cold stove, the wolf pendant's memory glinting in his mind. The prairie had spared him, but it demanded payment. Weeks turned to months, and the Dakota winds carried new shadows to his door. First came a warrior, his arm mangled from a bear trap, pride harder to mend than flesh. Jonas stitched him up, sharing whiskey to dull the pain, no questions asked. Then a woman, her child burning with fever, eyes desperate under the starlight. Jonas boiled herbs, sat vigil through the night, and watched the child's breath steady. Word spread like wildfire across the plains. Jonas's ranch was a haven, a strange oasis in a land scarred by war. Each visitor carved a piece of him, their faces blending with his ghosts. He worked his land by day, mending fences, herding cattle. But the nights belonged to the oath. A lost hunter, a wounded scout, an elder seeking shelter from a storm. They came, and Jonas gave what he had. Bread, bandages, a fire's warmth. The settlers in Deadwood whispered, some calling him a traitor, others a fool. Jonas didn't care. He'd stopped listening to saloon gossip the day he buried his family. The prairie taught him what mattered. Years rolled by, the seasons turning like a slow wheel. The boy, now grown, returned each spring, his frame taller, his eyes sharper, but the wolf pendant still hung at his throat. He called Jonas Father of the Plains, a name that stuck among the Lakota. They shared stories by the fire, the boy's English halting but earnest, Jonas's Lakota clumsy but sincere. Red Knife never came, but word reached Jonas that the warrior's hatred had cooled, tempered by time and the boy's tales. When Jonas's hair turned gray, his hands gnarled by years of labor, the prairie still watched. One winter night, he sat by his fire, the cabin creaking under a bitter wind. His eyes closed, and he didn't wake. The Lakota came at dawn, led by the boy, now a warrior, proud and strong. They carried Jonas across the hills, past the cottonwood where his family rested, to a place where the stars burned brightest. There, under the open sky, they laid him down. Their songs were rising like smoke, honoring a man who'd bridged two worlds with a single oath. The prairie kept his story, whispering it through the grass, from Deadwood to the Black Hills. Jonas Mercer, the Wasatchew who chose mercy over blood, became a legend, not of wealth or glory, but of a debt paid in full under a sky that never forgot. The tale of Jonas Mercer and the Lakota boy lingers like dust on the Dakota plains, a story of mercy carved into a land of conflict. What did you feel as Jonas faced his trial, binding two worlds with an oath? Share your thoughts. Where does this story take you? Your reflections keep these frontier legends alive. I'm grateful for your time, for riding alongside this journey through the wilds of 1877. Until we meet again under the starlit sky, keep the fire of these stories burning. Join me for the next tale, where the prairie whispers new secrets.